Let's do a big clap to get the people in from the other room. So I wanted to start the day off with just a couple logistical things. For any of you who came to the conference last year, we did an open mic at the end of the day where everybody who's here, because a lot of you are very activated and involved in the field, get a chance to talk a little bit about what you're working on and what you'd like to get from this event and from the people in the room. So I'm just going to do a quick Slido poll just to collect information on how many of you would love to do a little 30-second, 1-minute intro at the end of the day. So Mira, can we get that up on the screen? Would you like to do an open mic participation? Please get your Slidos out and contribute to that poll. Oh, so far 2 people know. Some will think about it. And this is not, you don't have to make a commitment here. We'll check in throughout the day, and of course, if you decide at the last minute, we'll make time for you. Just trying to scope out how much time that might take. Okay, cool. All right, so it looks like maybe about 10 people or so. So we'll bring this poll up at lunchtime again to see where people are. Awesome. The second thing I'm going to ask is, so we are going to put together a wrap party from 5 to 7 after the event is done, but we actually have not planned the wrap party in its entirety yet. So you are going to help us plan the remaining part of the wrap party. So we have 2 very on-brand sounding bars that we're considering going to after the event. The first is called Miracle of Science, which is a science-themed bar, which is a 16-minute walk away. Very on-brand. The second choice, also on-brand, Glass House, which has an outdoor facility and ping pong tables outside. So please contribute what you'd like to go to. I mean, outdoor ping pong table versus no outdoor ping pong table speaks for itself. I know a lot of people are traveling out of town also, so great. So we'll check in on this a little bit later in the day too. It's looking like Glass House is going to be the winner. All right, so I'm going to pass the mic on to Erin, and we'll get started with our programming for the day. Thank you.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome. At New Harvest, one of our most common requests is for help making sense of the broader cellular agriculture landscape, the companies and the researchers who are active in the space, where the funding is coming from, and what the current state of the art is. Radicle Labs is a disruption research firm that business leaders from some of the world's largest companies turn to in order to turn potential threats into opportunities. Tobias Citron is an analyst at Radicle who joins us today to provide a current snapshot of the cellular agriculture industry as it stands today. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker of the day, Tobias Citron.
Hey everyone, first of all, thank you so much for being here on a Saturday morning. I really appreciate all of you coming out. Thank you for that kind introduction. So like Erin said, I'm going to be speaking today about the startup and venture landscape across cellular agriculture. And at Radicle, what we really do is help corporates better understand startup landscapes so that they can partner with and invest in interesting and disruptive companies. So we marry advanced data science with firsthand insights from startup founders and management teams to uniquely enable our customers to understand and engage with startups. And this all culminates in a product that we call the Debrief, which features some of the tools that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. Data science, both to identify interesting companies and to compare those companies once they're identified. Outreach to businesses to help us understand their businesses better, but also to help us understand the landscape better. And also some surveying that we do to understand consumer habits, interests, pain points, and also to help inform our market sizing analysis. And I think the key thing here is that we're really taking the lens of what are startups doing in this category and how are investors investing in the sector overall. And so we've actually prepared a 100-plus page report on this overall sector that's available for purchase at the link below. And we've been commissioned by New Harvest. They provided underwriter support for this research, but we've retained all editorial independence in coming to our conclusions and viewpoints. Those are representative of our work solely. And I think it's worth mentioning also that the report that's available online, the proceeds of those purchases will be split between Radicle and New Harvest. So whenever we conduct a deep dive of a sector, we're asking three fundamental questions. Number one, what is the startup landscape, which basically means who's participating in the sector overall. Number two, why are investors backing these startups? And number three, how do the startups actually compare? So we'll actually go through these questions and hopefully provide a little bit of a snippet of what's included in the overall report. But before we do that, the most important question off the bat is, why is this interesting at all from a startup and entrepreneurial and investment perspective? So the first thing that jumps out at us when we do our analysis is how much money a particular sector has raised in terms of venture capital. At $767 million in total funding, the sector is in the top quartile of all sectors that we have analyzed. And this is a database of 125 plus sectors that we've done really rigorous and deep analysis of for our customers. So it's significant to say that the sector overall has garnered this much funding. And why has it garnered this much funding? As you see here, and we'll sprinkle these quotes from startup founders in the space throughout the presentation, clean meat is one of the most extreme ways to really achieve a significant impact on the planet, animal welfare, and humans. I mean, really the thrust of this investment is coming from the fact that the problems that these companies are solving are incredibly significant. And so we'll go through a few of them really quickly, and I'm sure they're things that you all know a lot about and have heard a lot about, but environmental issues, 18% of greenhouse gas emissions come from livestock farming, more than from transportation and cattle. Obviously a huge issue specifically even among livestock farming generally. Unsustainable food supply. The production of meat and poultry domestically is expected to surpass 100 billion pounds for the first time ever in 2018, and the UN estimates that our supplies must increase dramatically to cover population growth and to cover increased demand for food and poultry. So the question remains, where do we get that supply? How do we cover that increasing population growth and demand? And then the third one we'll highlight very quickly is inefficiency and waste. So over a quarter of the Earth's ice-free surface, which is equal to 70% of agricultural land, is used for livestock farming, and over a quarter of our freshwater footprint is used to produce animal products. So many resources being sunk into the creation of these animal products. How can we find another way to produce them without those resources? And there are a lot of other problems, obviously, that I could talk about. But I think the key thing here from a venture and investment perspective is that the problem is so significant, even relative to other startup sectors that we look at our company. So importantly, who's actually trying to solve these problems? What is the startup landscape? What do the companies look like, and how do they kind of compare? So first things first, cellular agriculture, what is it? What have we included in our sector when we've done our analysis? So we break up cellular agriculture really into cellular production and acellular production, and include companies that do both of those things when we think about how big the sector is for cellular agriculture in terms of startup activity. So cellular production, obviously, what you more commonly associate with cell ag, companies producing meat and seafood through living or once living cells in a lab. But just as interestingly and as importantly is acellular production, which is products made using organic molecules and not necessarily using living or once living cells. And the companies that are employing that technique, really companies that are making materials, other animal byproducts, rather than companies making meat and seafood. So important to understand that both categories of techniques for creating products are included in how we conceptualize the broader cellular agriculture sector. So what isn't cellular agriculture? We have not included companies that are obviously plant-based, that are not significantly using cell ag techniques to create their replication products. Two very well-known examples of companies that are primarily using plant-based alternatives are Impossible and Beyond that have both raised significant amounts of venture funding. It's notable how much venture funding is in the space, despite us not including those kinds of companies when we actually mapped out the sector constituents. So again, how well funded is the sector? And this is just a chart showing you visually where cell ag compares to the other sectors that we've looked at in terms of percentiles. So again, it's in the top percentile of all sectors that we've looked at. That's $767 million in disclosed funding. 19 constituents, which just means that there are 19 companies that we technically included in our definition of who is in the sector. Important to note, the 19 number, our sectors typically have 10 to 15 companies in them. So 19 is a pretty high number, I think representative of just how much activity is happening in the sector, even relative to other very high growth and very exciting sectors. And another thing that I would note is that in addition to a lot of funding coming into the space, obviously that funding is still flowing. Mosa Meat raised money last week. And so still a lot of interest in venture funding coming in. This isn't something that appears to be slowing down. So when we think about the companies in the sector and what they do, broadly speaking, there are sort of three places on the value chain that we analyzed. Number one, companies that are primarily technology platforms, making things like bioreactors, hardware, to make the process of culturing meat and making these products more efficient and specifically more cost efficient. There are also companies that are more focused on raw inputs, offering things like egg whites and milk proteins that are going to be sold to businesses to incorporate into their products rather than being sold as standalone end products. And then we finally have companies that are planning on making products that will actually be sold to consumers either through retail or grocery or through actual restaurants. And this isn't to say that companies are only doing one of these things. Many, and I would say most, are actually operating across various parts of the value chain, but important just to get this visual in mind as we think about what companies are doing and how we can kind of silo them into different categories. And so if we have an example of each kind of company, and again, it doesn't mean that they're only doing this, but representative of that broader place in the value chain. Future Meat is one company that's more focused on technology, developing a recyclable growth medium that's going to reduce production costs of actually culturing cells and have raised money strategically from Tyson. Company that we think is representative of sort of the raw inputs B2B approach is Bolt, which has raised over $200 million in total. A company that is making materials like silks and leathers that are going to be incorporated into the products of big brands. And so you see on the right-hand side a photo of their collaboration with Stella McCartney, obviously a very well-known clothing brand. These are companies that are offering their materials and their inputs to bigger brands to incorporate into their consumer products rather than selling directly to consumers. And then finally, an example of a company that's planning on actually selling products to end consumers, either through restaurants or grocery, is Mosa Meat, the first company to actually publicly cook a lab-grown beef burger, and is still in the research process developing that at scale and making it cost-effective. And so importantly here is to note that not only has a lot of funding been raised in this space, but the categories are attracting high-quality investors. And when I talk about categories as opposed to sector, what I really mean is that there are a lot of subcategories within this sector, a lot of diversity, obviously, different kinds of products, different places on the value chain. Across the board, really high-quality investors are flocking to pour money into the space. You see some examples on the left-hand side of some very prominent investors that have invested in companies that are in our sector. And we would also note that 5 of the companies in our sector have what we call an average or above average ICS, which stands for Investor Cluster Score. At Radicle, we have data science tools, like I said, that help us evaluate companies in the broad landscape of the universe of all startups that exist. The Investor Cluster Score runs algorithms to better understand how good the cap table of a specific company is, how selective and how high quality the investors that have invested in a specific company are. It enables us to compare that investor cluster score to any investor cluster score out of the universe of all startups that exist. And so out of that universe, 5 companies in our sector have average or above average scores, which just, again, underscores that high-quality investors are investing in these companies in addition to there being a lot of funding. Important to note, even though there's a lot of venture money being poured into the space, companies see the value of getting diverse kinds of funding. So you'll see here one of the companies that we spoke to. From long-term projects, we target government grants, but for short-term ones, R&D and strategic partnerships are great. I think the key message that we got in terms of funding from companies was that venture is great for a certain stage in your development, but there are a lot of other sources of funding, from R&D partnerships to grants to strategic funding, that are good depending on when in your life cycle you're at. So one form of funding not necessarily better than the other, just different and used for different purposes. So why are investors actually backing these startups? What about the opportunity is exciting for investors? At Radicle, we like to think about opportunity, broadly speaking, through the lens of what's changing and how big the actual market size is. And so if we think about what's changed, we'll highlight 3 things specifically. Number 1 is the general increased interest in replacing animal consumption. This is a trend that's not only true in the Western world, in the US and Europe, but is increasingly true in other markets as well, such as Asia. It's been well documented, the rise in vegetarianism and veganism, at least domestically, and so obviously something that's pushing the interest in this space from an investor perspective. The evolution of cellular agriculture as a science and as a technology, I think many of the people in the room have a very large hand in having that accelerate to such an extent. Obviously, it's developed so much and is only going to develop in the years to come. And finally, regulatory change. Although regulatory change has not been something that's been incredibly active in the US recently, I think the companies that we spoke to, and from our perspective, this is something that's going to change a lot in the coming years. There's an FDA meeting that happened last week about cell ag and how to regulate it. And I think across the board, there's a lot of optimism that this will become an increasingly important part of how regulators think about the food space more broadly. And so from just a key sort of data point that we wanted to bring up from our consumer survey data, that 63% of respondents are more interested in replacing animal product consumption today than they were 5 years ago. And so the key thing here is that not only does this interest exist in our population, but it is increasing as well. And so it just speaks to the first what's changed point about overall increases in interest in replacing animal consumption, being a very important reason why investors are broadly interested. And the second part of thinking about the opportunity more broadly is thinking about what the market size is. And so we do a bottoms-up analysis at Radicle, incorporating a lot of our survey data into how we evaluate the market. And we do both a total addressable market, which is really the high-end market opportunities across the board, sort of what's the best case scenario for how big this market can be. And we do an evaluation of what the serviceable addressable market is, meaning what's the more realistic market size based on some risk factors. You'll see again that both of these numbers are in the top quartile of all sectors that we've analyzed and spans 125 plus sectors in our database that we've done real rigorous analysis on for our customers. The key thing here, again, that I would highlight, it's actually not written down, is that there is a pretty big difference between that $1.6 trillion number and the $44 billion number. Bigger difference than we typically see between our total and serviceable addressable market sizes. I think that that's probably a result of some of the inherent risks that exist in the sector that I think are obviously important to mention. Risks around regulation, risks around what true market adoption of these products are going to be, especially as plant-based alternatives develop and people are perhaps already more familiar with those products. So even though it's a huge market opportunity, it's also a very uncertain market opportunity with a lot of latent risks that we're yet to really see how those risks will affect what the market opportunity truly is. And so because of the big market size, one important insight that we gathered from speaking to a lot of businesses was that startups really think that there are going to be multiple winners in this sector. So you see, quote here, "We're targeting a multi-trillion-dollar market opportunity to feed the world. Of course, there's room for many players." Important point is to note that these companies think that this sector is going to have to be supported by a lot of really successful businesses. And so even though there are 19 constituents in our sector, even though activity is really high right now and there are a lot of companies emerging, in our perspective, there's still room for a lot of companies to enter the space and offer disruptive products, even though there are already a lot of companies just because of the sheer market opportunity. And so how do the startups actually compare? This is sort of the last question we ask, broadly speaking, in our analysis. We'll just give you a little taste of this, of some of the analysis that we do in our broader research. So one interesting lens to look at this market through is to think about what the opportunity of different subcategories within the sector is relative to the ETA of those products, or the estimated time of arrival of those products. There's a real trade-off that's apparent for investors, for entrepreneurs entering the space, between the high-end market opportunity for a specific category within the broader cell ag sector and how quickly they can get to market, right? So on one end, you have materials companies, which, although still a huge market opportunity, might represent a slightly lower market opportunity than the broader food space. But those products are fairly ready to be on the market. Some of them have been released in limited capacities. And so the readiness scale there is a lot more optimistic. When you get to food and you get to meat and poultry, you're still a few years away, even though that's a much bigger market opportunity. And so from an investor perspective, really a trade-off there in terms of thinking, if I'm going to enter this space, do I want to invest in something that is ready, or do I want to invest in something where the high-end market opportunity is perhaps the biggest of any category in the world? And so some concluding thoughts just to tie all of this analysis and research together. First of all, this is a really well-funded sector, even relative to other sectors that we've looked at. It has a lot of startups participating, a lot of different business models, companies competing across the entire value chain with different kinds of customers and different kinds of products. So I want to really underscore the well-funded nature of it, but also the variety that lies within it. Startups are pursuing a diverse set of funding opportunities. VC interest is increasing, even in food. So even though VC interest is increasing, like I said, startups are interested in grants, other forms of funding, strategic investors, depending on where in their development they are and what their immediate goals are. And so despite the amazing VC interest that's been exhibited, a lot of interest in different forms of funding and research partnerships and other things like that. The sector has undergone and is expected to further undergo significant change that creates a novel opportunity for disruption. This is really speaking from an investment perspective. The stuff that's changing to create this opportunity, the things that have already changed and the things that are expected to change, are really notable, even relative to other high-growth sectors that we look at. And so from an investment perspective, I think it's easy to understand why there's so much excitement, just based on what's changed and what's continuing to change to create this really interesting opportunity. This is an enormous market opportunity, again, but risks obviously do exist. I think on the high end, one of the biggest markets that we've looked at in terms of sheer size and opportunity, but also one of the most uncertain markets that we've looked at because of all the risk factors I spoke about and the uncertainty around real adoption of these products a few years down the line. And then finally, trade-offs currently exist between market readiness of products and, quote-unquote, the size of the prize. Because of the variety of products in this overall sector, there is a big timeline variation in terms of when companies are actually going to release their products. And there's also some variation in terms of what the actual ultimate size of the market opportunity is for specific products. So trade-offs definitely exist at this current point in time. And again, just want to emphasize that this is a part of our very deep dive, which includes a 100-plus page report into this overall sector. Hopefully this has given you just a little snippet and taste of some of the conclusions we reach and some of the analysis we do. We actually have some pamphlets with some more information and the URL that enables you to access this report out on the information table outside. So feel free to pick one of those up on your way out. But thank you so much for your time, and we'll open it up to questions.